The air in the Vatican thrummed with a heavy, ominous silence, broken only by the rustle of official robes and the low murmurs of nervous attendants. In a chamber steeped in centuries of power and dogma, a papal bull was being read aloud, its pronouncements echoing with dire spiritual consequences for a distant republic. Every word, meticulously crafted, landed with the weight of divine judgment, each syllable a threat against the soul. This was not a plea, but a decree, a spiritual hammer poised to strike. Pope Paul Sarpi, a man whose conviction in papal supremacy was absolute and unyielding, stood before his cardinals, his gaze fixed and stern. "Let the Venetian Republic be excommunicated, and its lands placed under interdict," he declared, his voice resonating with an authority he believed was granted directly by God. His words were not just legal or political, they were meant to sever Venice from the body of Christ, to plunge its people into spiritual darkness, to force submission through fear of eternal damnation. He expected capitulation, a quick and decisive victory over what he saw as an errant flock. Across the Adriatic, in the opulent yet pragmatic Doge's palace, Leonardo Donato, the elected leader of Venice, received the news. The messenger's voice was hushed, relaying the terrible pronouncements from Rome. Donato listened, his face a mask of calm. There was no visible shock, no immediate sign of panic. Instead, he absorbed the gravity of the message with a calculated, almost imperceptible nod. But for those who knew him, for those who watched closely, a defiant glint flickered in his eyes. It was a spark of resolve, a quiet refusal to bend that surprised many who had anticipated immediate submission, an urgent scramble to appease the angry pontiff. Almost immediately, the first whispers of fear began to ripple through the labyrinthine alleys and bustling squares of Venice. The most immediate and chilling sign of the interdict's enforcement was the sudden, eerie silence. Church bells, which had for centuries marked the rhythm of daily life, calling the faithful to prayer, announcing births, deaths, and celebrations, now stood mute. Their bronze tongues were stilled, their voices choked by papal decree. This was just the beginning. The full weight of spiritual isolation, the true meaning of being cut off from the sacraments, from the comfort of the church, was yet to be fully understood by the common people. They knew something terrible had happened, but the depth of the spiritual wound was still unfathomable. For a republic born of water and defiant spirit, even the highest spiritual thunder could not drown its resolve. Venice, often called the most serene republic, had always charted its own course, its independence fiercely guarded. Yet this defiance came with a heavy cost. The question hung unspoken in the humid Venetian air, carried on the gentle sea breeze. What price would Venice pay for such audacious defiance, and who would ultimately bear the cost? The answer was far from clear, shrouded in the uncertainty of an unprecedented spiritual war. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. The stage for this monumental clash was 16th century Venice, a republic unlike any other in Europe. It was a city born from the sea, a unique maritime power meticulously constructed on a foundation of trade, innovation, and an almost fanatical independent spirit. Imagine a sprawling network of labyrinthine canals, not roads, where gondolas and market boats replaced carriages. The iconic Rialto Bridge wasn't just a crossing, it was the beating heart of commerce. A constant hum of merchants haggling, goods changing hands, and news spreading faster than the tides. At the center of it all stood the Doge's palace, not a king's castle, but a powerful symbol of Venice's distinct republican governance, where an elected leader, the Doge, served at the pleasure of the powerful Senate. This was a place where power was shared, debated, and fiercely protected by a tight-knit network of patrician families. These families, with names like Contarini, Grimani, and Morosini, weren't just wealthy. They were the Republic itself, Their loyalty to Venice often superseded personal ambition, creating a robust, if sometimes ruthless, political landscape. Daily life in Venice moved to its own rhythm, a vibrant symphony of human activity. Early mornings would see the markets burst to life, the air thick with the smell of fresh fish, spices from the east, and strong Italian coffee. Fishermen would bring in their catch, gondoliers would begin their day ferrying passengers, and the workshops of glass-blowers and silk weavers would hum with activity. As the day progressed, the canals would fill with boats, the squares with people, and the grand palazzi along the Grand Canal would prepare for opulent evening galas, where politics and pleasure often intertwined. It was a culture both vibrant and pragmatic, valuing wealth and beauty, but always underpinned by a fierce practicality and an unwavering commitment to the Republic's prosperity. Religiously, Venice was undoubtedly Catholic, but its relationship with Rome had always been, shall we say, complicated. Unlike most European states where the Church held significant sway, Venice maintained a strong, almost defiant, tradition of state control over ecclesiastical affairs. The Republic appointed its own bishops, often taxed church property without papal consent, and insisted that all religious matters within its borders ultimately answered to the Doge and the Senate, not the Pope. This was a constant source of friction, a low-burning fire that occasionally flared into open dispute. Small historical examples peppered Venice's past, illustrating its consistent assertion of independence against papal authority. There were disputes over tithes, over the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical courts, and even struggles over who had the right to appoint parish priests. Venice consistently pushed back, asserting its right to govern its own affairs, even when those affairs touched upon the spiritual. This pattern of friction established a clear understanding. Venice would not easily bow to outside pressure, religious or otherwise. From Rome's perspective, Pope Paul V saw Venice not just as a wealthy and influential city, but as an obstinate outlier in Catholic Europe. It was a republic that, despite its deep Catholic roots, continually challenged his universal spiritual dominion. Venice's independent streak, its insistence on secular control, and its willingness to tax church property directly contradicted the Pope's vision of a powerful, unified church with supreme authority over all matters, spiritual and temporal. The growing unease in Rome concerning Venice's increasingly assertive secular policies regarding church property and clerical jurisdiction was palpable. These weren't just minor disagreements. They were seen as direct challenges to the very foundation of papal power. The seeds of conflict were not just sown, they had been steadily growing for decades, cultivated by a republic determined to be its own master, and a papacy equally determined to assert its divine right. The seeds of conflict had been growing for decades, and by the early 17th century, the cracks in the relationship between Venice and the papacy were deepening significantly. It wasn't just abstract ideas of sovereignty. Specific events brought these tensions to a head, illustrating a long history of escalating conflict that made the eventual interdict almost inevitable. One of the most glaring points of contention arose from Venice's insistence on its state jurisdiction over ecclesiastical figures. The Republic believed that even clerics, when they committed common crimes, should be subject to Venetian law just like any other citizen. This belief was put to the test dramatically with the arrests of two clerics, Canon Saraceni and Count Brandolino of Valmarino. Saraceni, an Augustinian canon, faced charges of theft, abduction, and sexual misconduct, while Brandolino, an abbot, was accused of murder and other serious offences. Venice tried both individuals in its secular courts, convicting them and asserting its right to do so. This was not a new stance for Venice, but Rome saw it as a direct challenge, an affront to the Church's ancient privileges of clerical immunity, which held that clerics should only be judged by ecclesiastical courts. Pope Paul V's reaction to these arrests was immediate and intense. He viewed Venice's actions as an outright assault on the Church's divine authority and an unacceptable encroachment on papal power. His fury was not just about the two clerics, it was about the principle. If Venice could try priests, where would it end? This was, in his eyes, a dangerous precedent that undermined the very structure of the Catholic Church. Adding fuel to the fire were Venice's laws concerning church property. The Republic had enacted legislation restricting the alienation of church property, meaning religious institutions couldn't easily sell or transfer their land and assets without state approval. Furthermore, Venice required state permission for the construction of any new churches or the establishment of new religious foundations. From Rome's perspective, these laws were a clear infringement on ecclesiastical wealth and influence, an attempt by the secular state to control spiritual matters and the Church's financial independence. They saw it as Venice trying to dictate how the Church managed its own resources, a line they believed no secular power should cross. The Pope's repeated demands for Venice to revoke these laws and surrender the arrested clerics were met with steadfast refusal. Each Venetian rejection was more than just a legal disagreement. It was a subtle humiliation to papal prestige, a public display of defiance that chipped away at the Pope's perceived universal authority. These weren't just minor squabbles. They were direct challenges to the Pope's claims of supremacy. There had been earlier, failed attempts at diplomatic resolution. Envoys traveled back and forth between Venice and Rome, trying to find common ground. But these efforts always crumbled, with both sides perceiving the other as breaking implicit understandings or reneging on prior agreements. The trust was eroding, replaced by suspicion and a hardening of positions. The Pope's rhetoric became increasingly aggressive. He issued severe warnings and then ultimatums, each one more threatening than the last, culminating in the declaration that would rock the entire Christian world. This wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the final stage of a long, drawn-out battle. The gradual hardening of positions on both sides had transformed what began as a jurisdictional dispute into a profound test of sovereignty and spiritual authority, revealing that the interdict was not a sudden act, but the culmination of years of deep-seated tension and mutual defiance. The air in Venice grew thick with an unspoken dread, as the final desperate negotiations between the Republic and Rome played out. These talks were marked by a stubborn refusal to budge on either side. Cardinal Borghese, the Pope's nephew and a key figure in the Roman Curia, stood firm, representing the papal demand for absolute obedience. His message was clear. Venice must revoke its laws and hand over the clerics, or face the most severe spiritual punishment. But Venice was just as unyielding. The Venetian Senate, a body renowned for its pragmatic and independent spirit, held firm. They were guided by the sharp legal mind of Paolo Sarpi, a brilliant Servite friar and theologian. Sarpi articulated a powerful defense of state sovereignty, arguing that in temporal matters, the Republic's authority was supreme, even over the Church. His writings and counsel provided the intellectual backbone for Venice's defiance, giving the senators the confidence to resist Rome's spiritual threats with legal and philosophical arguments. For Venice, this wasn't just about two clerics or a few laws. It was about the fundamental right of a sovereign state to govern itself without external interference, especially from a foreign power, even if that power claimed divine authority. As the standoff continued, a deep anxiety settled over the Venetian populace. The threat of interdict, a spiritual embargo, loomed large, casting a shadow over daily life. Merchants, ever practical, worried about the economic repercussions. What would happen to trade if Venice was cut off from the rest of Catholic Europe? Would their ships be unwelcome in other ports? Would their goods be shunned? These were real, tangible fears. Meanwhile, the more devout citizens grappled with spiritual uncertainty. The idea of being denied sacraments, of dying without last rites, caused genuine distress. The thought of their churches falling silent, their beloved rituals ceasing, was a heavy burden on their hearts. Beyond Venice, the drama played out on a larger European stage. Neighboring states and powerful empires watched closely, their reactions mixed. Some, particularly Protestant nations eager to see the Pope's authority challenged, quietly applauded Venice's assertion of independence. They saw a fellow secular power standing up to what they considered papal overreach. Others, staunchly Catholic monarchies, sided with the Pope, condemning Venice's defiance as heresy and rebellion. This created a complex geopolitical backdrop, with Venice's struggle becoming a symbol in the wider European religious and political conflicts of the time. Every diplomatic exchange, every rumor, was scrutinized as the balance of power in Europe hung in the balance. Doge Leonardo Donato and Fra Paolo Sarpi carried an immense weight on their shoulders. They had to balance the Republic's independence, its very identity, with the spiritual well-being of its citizens. This was a tightrope walk, pushing both men to their emotional and strategic limits. Donato, with his calm demeanor, outwardly projected strength, but the strain of the situation was undeniable. Sarpi, the intellectual warrior, feverishly worked on treatises and arguments, but even his sharp mind must have felt the pressure of potentially leading his beloved republic into spiritual isolation. The Venetian summer, usually a time of vibrant life and celebration, now seemed oppressive. The heat was heavy, mirroring the tension in the air. Hushed whispers replaced the usual boisterous chatter in the campi, the city's small squares. The distant solemn tolling of church bells, not yet silenced, seemed to underscore the gravity of the impending crisis, each peal a reminder of the spiritual clock ticking down. This atmosphere, thick with anticipation and dread, contributed to the psychological weight of the impending interdict, making it feel like an inevitable, almost physical, force. Finally, the papal ultimatum arrived, unheeded and rejected. It was the last straw, the point of no return. The stage was now set for the dramatic and unprecedented imposition of the interdict, a spiritual weapon that the Pope believed would bring proud Venice to its knees. But Venice, as history would soon show, was not easily brought to heel. The moment of truth arrived on April 17th, 1606. Pope Paul V, having exhausted all diplomatic avenues and seeing his ultimatums ignored, formally issued the papal bull of interdict against Venice. The decree was stark, outlining severe spiritual penalties. No sacraments could be administered, no burials were allowed in consecrated ground, and no public masses could be celebrated. Any clergy who dared to defy this order would face immediate excommunication. It was a spiritual hammer blow, designed to isolate Venice completely and force its submission through the anguish of its faithful citizens. But Venice, guided by its deep-seated republican spirit and the sharp legal mind of Paolo Sarpi, was ready. The Venetian Senate, with remarkable speed and audacity, issued its own counter-order. This decree commanded all clergy within the Republic's domains to ignore the Pope's interdict and to continue their duties as usual. The penalty for non-compliance was swift and severe: immediate expulsion from Venetian territory. It was a direct challenge, a clear declaration that in Venice the state's authority superseded even that of the Pope. This created an agonizing dilemma for every priest, monk, and bishop within Venice's borders. They were caught between two formidable powers, each demanding absolute obedience. On one side, the Pope threatened eternal damnation and excommunication, the gravest spiritual punishment imaginable. On the other, the Republic threatened immediate expulsion, stripping them of their livelihoods, their homes, and their communities. It was a choice between their spiritual allegiance to Rome and their civic loyalty to Venice, a decision that would define their lives and, they believed, their souls. Yet to the astonishment of many, the vast majority of the Venetian clergy chose defiance, swayed by a potent mix of patriotism, a deep-seated fear of state reprisal, and the compelling legal and theological arguments put forth by Sarpi. They largely ignored the papal bull. Churches remained open, masses continued, and the sacraments were administered. The bells of Venice, which the Pope had intended to silence, continued to peal, a defiant chorus against Rome's spiritual thunder. This widespread compliance with the Venetian Senate's order was a powerful testament to the unique bond between the Republic and its people, including its clergy. The few religious orders who refused to comply faced the full force of Venetian resolve. The Jesuits, known for their unwavering loyalty to the papacy, along with the Capuchins and Theatines, publicly declared their inability to defy the Pope. Their refusal was met not with negotiation, but with immediate action. They were dramatically expelled from Venetian territory, their departure a stark, visual representation of the Republic's unwavering commitment to its sovereignty. Their empty monasteries and convents served as a powerful message to any who might consider challenging Venice's authority. Fra Paolo Sarpi emerged as the intellectual architect of this audacious defiance. His legal and theological arguments provided Venice with a powerful justification for its actions, framing the conflict not as a rebellion against God, but as a defense of legitimate state authority over temporal matters. He meticulously dissected papal claims, arguing for the distinct spheres of spiritual and temporal power, a concept radical for its time. Sarpi's writings became the backbone of Venetian resistance, giving intellectual weight to their political stance. The Interdict, intended to break Venice and bring it to its knees, instead solidified its resolve. It revealed the profound depth of its republican spirit and the unique, almost symbiotic relationship between the Venetian state and its church. This decision to defy the Pope was a radical act, establishing a precedent for state sovereignty against papal authority that resonated across Europe. It was a clear demonstration that a secular power could stand firm against the spiritual might of Rome. The Venetian Interdict, far from being a local dispute, quickly became an international spectacle. Protestant nations across Europe, still reeling from the Reformation, watched with keen interest, many applauding Venice's bold stand against papal authority. They saw in Venice's defiance a powerful validation of their own struggles against Rome's universal claims. Conversely, the staunchly Catholic powers, particularly Spain, largely condemned Venice, viewing its actions as a dangerous precedent that undermined the very fabric of Catholic unity and papal supremacy. This polarization further deepened the existing religious and political divides on the continent, turning a regional conflict into a geopolitical chess match. While Venice largely weathered the spiritual storm, the Interdict did not pass without some cost. There was indeed economic disruption, particularly in areas reliant on pilgrimage or ecclesiastical patronage, though Venice's robust trade networks largely cushioned the blow. More significantly, there was social anxiety, especially among the deeply pious who grappled with the spiritual implications of defying the Pope. Whispers of damnation and fear for the souls of their loved ones created an undercurrent of unease, even as the state maintained a facade of calm. Doge Donato and Sarpi were acutely aware of this internal tension, knowing that prolonged spiritual isolation could eventually erode public support. It was King Henry IV of France who stepped into this volatile situation as the crucial mediator. A shrewd politician, Henry had recently converted to Catholicism to secure his throne, but maintained a pragmatic approach to interstate relations. He recognized that a protracted conflict between Venice and the papacy could destabilize Italy and potentially ignite a wider European war, drawing in other powers. His diplomatic efforts were relentless, characterized by intricate negotiations and a delicate balancing act to find a solution that allowed both sides to save face without a clear victor. The compromise, eventually reached in 1607, was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity. Venice formally handed over the two arrested clerics, the original spark of the conflict, not directly to Rome, but to the French ambassador, Cardinal de Joyeuse. This subtle distinction allowed Venice to avoid the humiliation of direct submission to the Pope. Crucially, Venice did not formally revoke its controversial laws regarding church property and clerical jurisdiction. Instead, the Pope, through the French intermediary, lifted the interdict and excommunications, accepting Venice's implicit promise to be more circumspect in future applications of the laws. The expelled religious orders, however, were not immediately allowed to return, a lingering testament to Venice's unwavering stance. Despite the concessions, the outcome was widely perceived as a moral and political victory for Venice. The Republic had successfully defied the spiritual and temporal might of the papacy for over a year, maintained its sovereignty, and forced a powerful pope to compromise. It demonstrated that a secular state could stand firm against papal authority without suffering catastrophic spiritual or temporal consequences. The Pope's universal authority had been implicitly challenged, and in the eyes of many, diminished. Doge Donato, a man of quiet resolve, reflected on the ordeal with Fra Paolo Sarpi. The price of their independence had been high, demanding unwavering courage and strategic brilliance. Sarpi, ever the pragmatist, continued his work, tirelessly advocating for the supremacy of the state in temporal matters. His writings, born from the crucible of the Interdict, became foundational texts for future generations, grappling with the complex relationship between church and state. The Venetian Interdict thus became a landmark event, a pivotal moment in European history. It influenced future debates on church-state relations, providing a powerful example for those who argued for secular sovereignty. It contributed significantly to the intellectual currents that would eventually lead to the Enlightenment, challenging established notions of divine right and papal infallibility. This episode is a powerful, intimate reflection on the nature of power, faith, and the unyielding spirit of a republic that dared to chart its own course. Venice, a city born of water and sustained by an independent spirit, proved that even the highest spiritual thunder could not drown its resolve. It left a lasting legacy, a testament to the enduring human desire for freedom and the courage to defy even the most formidable authorities for the sake of self-determination. The story of the Venetian Interdict reminds us that sometimes the most profound victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet, steadfast assertion of one's own truth.